in systems wood is a clearing, and in that clearing is a house. The door of that house is always open. It's not because the owner is particularly welcoming, it's because he never remembers to close it. The doormat is covered with unopened letters and bills because the owner always forgets to check his post. The milk bottles are never brought in because the owner never remembers to collect them. The owner of the house is Mr Forgetful. He has 3 breakfasts a day just because he doesn't remember eating the first 2. He can never find his shoes because he can't remember where he put them. Mr Forgetful is a senior engineer. Nobody quite understands how he became one, and of course he doesn't remember, but he is one all the same. Mr Forgetful designs and develops applications and systems. He's actually quite good at it. He might be very forgetful, but he's got an excellent grasp of architecture and technology. He's not Mr Inept, after all. Mr Forgetful's clients really like him, at least when he remembers to turn up to meetings and remembers where the offices are. Several months ago, Mr Forgetful designed a system that connected several different client components together. It's a very good system. It's really useful. It's what the clients have wanted for a very long time. Mr Forgetful's system had been running for a while, and the client decided that the system was so good that they wanted to extend it and invest in it a bit more. They decided to stand up a whole team to look after the system and add functionality to it. They called a big meeting and everyone was invited. Mr Architecture came in to do some planning around how it could work with the other enterprise critical tools. Little Miss Cloud came in to help to decouple the components and move the system off the old legacy hosting. Mr DevOps came to containerize and automate it. Little Miss Assurance came to make sure that it was safe to deploy and could be relied on. Mr Forgetful didn't turn up. He'd got trapped in his own wardrobe and he couldn't remember how to get out. He'd got trapped in the wardrobe looking for his trousers because he couldn't remember where he'd put them. He'd also forgotten that he doesn't often wear trousers, and he'd also forgotten that he's been warned about this before. Mr Architecture said, "Look, it's 11:30 now. He's clearly not coming. Let's get a plan in place before we eat all the donuts." Mr Architecture is an ENTP, so draw your own conclusions. "I quite agree," said Little Miss Assurance through a mouthful of raspberry jam. "We need to get the rest of the production databases hooked up to the system. Does anybody know whether this system will work with a relational database or can it be document driven?" Nobody seemed sure. "I, for one, want to get this whole thing containerized so Little Miss Cloud can deploy it," said Mr DevOps. "Any idea what operating system he's designed it for? Do we know if it'll get through my build pipeline?" Nope. "Oh, well, we can always ask him when he shows up," said Mr DevOps. "Do we know if it's built in line with best practices according to our compliance framework?" said Little Miss Assurance, who was going for promotion this year, so had a tendency to say things like this. "It needs to be compliant with all our policies. Do we know if it's got the audit components and privilege management in place? Has he used the common components or has he rolled his own?" There's no more donuts. "Well, we can ask him when he turns up." "Doesn't look like we can do much yet then," said Mr Architecture. "We'll have to wait for him to show up and we can ask him then." "Hasn't he documented any of this stuff?" asked Little Miss Cloud. "If he hasn't remembered to tell us where it is," said Mr DevOps. 2 days later, Mr Forgetful showed up at the office. He hadn't remembered about the meeting. He'd just forgotten where the shops were and turned up by mistake.
"Hello, Mr Forgetful," said Mr Architecture. "I've been meaning to have a chat with you." "Oh, hello. Who are you?" asked Mr Forgetful. "Oh dear," said Mr Architecture. "I really should manage my expectations when talking to you."
"Ha ha ha! Yes, you should. Why? And who are you again?" The meeting was already in full swing. Little Miss Assurance had ordered pastries this time, and she and Mr DevOps had already had a brief but surprisingly heated argument about who had eaten the last apricot Danish. HR were looking on with interest.
"Now, Mr Forgetful, we've got a few questions about the system you built and designed," said Little Miss Assurance.
"Oh, what system is that?" asked Mr Forgetful.
The big one, the clever one you made. You must remember," said Little Miss Assurance.
Not really," said Mr Forgetful.
"Well, we need to know what databases you designed it to work with, what operating system it runs on, and whether it's compatible with our audit and privilege management components," said Little Miss Assurance.
"Oh, I'm afraid I don't remember," said Mr Forgetful.
"But you built it," said Mr DevOps. "You built it a couple of months ago. You must have deliberately designed it with these things in mind."
"Well, I suppose I must have done," said Mr Forgetful. "Nothing springs to mind, though."
"But the system works. It works well. We just need to understand how it works and why it works, and then I can migrate it," said Little Miss Cloud.
"I'm terribly sorry," said Mr Forgetful, "but I really don't remember any of it."
"Well, I've got the architecture diagrams here," said Mr Architecture. "These show us the high-level system design, but not the choices that you made to actually implement it. Do these help jog your memory?"
"Not at all, I'm afraid," said Mr Forgetful, reading it upside down.
"Mr Forgetful, this really isn't good enough," said Little Miss Assurance. "How can we be expected to make use of the system you built if we don't have any understanding about why you built it in the way you did? You can't seem to remember why you did any of it, so we're rather stuck."
"Oh, what system is that?" asked Mr Forgetful. Little Miss Cloud finished her pastry and thought about considering her options elsewhere in the sector. 8 weeks later, the entire project had been dissected and put back together by the team. Mr Architecture had pulled every component apart in order to understand what they did, what the dependencies were, and how they all worked with the wider business's tools. Some things he changed. He moved to a better database engine because the version that had been built into code was out of support, and the one he moved to would work with more database backends. He documented these decisions. Mr DevOps took a deep dive into the codebase and worked out what operating system had been used, what dependencies were there, and how to containerize it properly. He documented everything he discovered. Some things he changed. He migrated it to a more modern version of the operating system because it was more secure, and he documented why he'd done it. Little Miss Assurance looked into how the system worked with the client's audit and authorization components. She documented which components were used, which weren't, and what would need to happen to uplift the entire system. Little Miss Cloud looked into the system to work out how to migrate it to the cloud. Some parts she cut out and isolated so that they could stand alone on a separate machine to allow the system to scale better. She documented all of these decisions and why she'd done them. The team ended up not just with a working system, but a library of documentation which catalogued not just how the system worked technically, but how and why decisions had been made to build it in the way that they had. These documents are called Architecture Decision Records, and they help the team to understand the state of the system and make decisions in future armed with all the knowledge and context that they would need. Soon after, the team deployed the upgraded system to their corporate network. There was a big party and everyone was invited. Mr. Manager made an entirely uninformed speech claimed all the credit, used plenty of buzzwords that Little Miss Corporate had given him, and then pushed a big red button. Of course, this had no effect. The system was already running. The button was only really there so that Mr. Manager could feel as though he'd done something. Everybody clapped, and there was jelly and ice cream for everyone. Everyone but Mr. Forgetful. He'd forgotten to RSVP to the party invite. "Documenting everything properly has certainly saved the day," said Mr. Architecture. "Yes," said Little Miss Cloud. "And we're future-proof now. It should be a lot easier for us to work on the system from now on." "Us, or anyone else," said Mr. DevOps. "I'm off to build some pipelines. I don't want to have to touch Mr. Forgetful's messes ever again. Let Mr. Contractor do it. Ha ha ha." And they all laughed as if all the bubbles in their champagne had turned into hilarious jokes.